Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is Ground Lesson 4 in our VFR or Private Pilot Level Training series. In today's lesson we'll be covering VFR navigational charts or aeronautical charts, which will be a precursor to our lessons on VFR navigation and cross-country flying. For today's lesson we'll be looking at charts available on Skyvector.com, and there's a link to their site in the video description. The two primary types of VFR charts used in the U.S. are sectional charts and terminal area charts. The most common charts used are the sectional charts and are so named because when they were first produced in the 1930s, they were the first charts to depict the entire country and did so by dividing it into 87 sections. Today, the area each chart covers is slightly larger and there are fewer sections. Sectional charts are available on Skyvector for the entire continental U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, and the Caribbean. The Caribbean charts cover southern Florida, the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, San Juan, and the Caribbean islands as far south as the northern tip of St. Lucia. The Hawaiian chart also offers coverage of the northern Marinara Islands, Guam, and Samoa, and the charts in the upper northeast also offer some coverage of lower Canada, including Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. VFR information is also available on Skyvector for most of the rest of the world, but it is not as detailed as what you will find on U.S. sectional charts. Terminal area charts are available for large metropolitan areas with many busy airports. Areas covered by terminal area charts are depicted in magenta on the sectional chart coverage map and shown as a white square on the sectional charts. Now let's talk about how to read these charts. In order to be able to read any map, you need to know three things: orientation, scale, and symbology. Orientation is pretty straightforward. On most aeronautical charts, north is always up, or towards the top of the map, south is always down, or towards the bottom, west is on the left side, and east is on the right side. Many moving maps are also oriented this way, including those on the Garmin G1000 type panels and the Garmin 400 and 500 series of GPS receivers. Some moving maps can be configured as north up, but can also be configured to display track up, meaning that the aircraft's track is shown at the top of the screen. The scale on sectional charts is 1 to 500,000, meaning that an inch on the map equals 500,000 inches in the real world. In practical terms, this works out to be an inch on the map being equal to about 7 nautical miles. On digital charts, the scale works out when you're at a normal 1x zoom level, but there are better ways to measure miles on digital charts than converting them from inches. The scale on a terminal area chart is 1 to 250,000, working out to be about 3.5 nautical miles per inch. This larger scale allows them to show more detail in busy terminal areas. Symbology is what we'll spend most of the lesson talking about. Like most maps, many of the symbols used are covered in the legend. You can access the legend from Skyvector by clicking on an individual sectional chart, and then scrolling to the left edge of the chart for the legend. And I'll be conducting a brief tutorial on how to use Skyvector at the end of this lesson. With so many symbols, however, not all of them are covered in the legend. We'll cover the most commonly found symbols in this video, but if you want to do a deep dive into chart symbology, you should pick up the FAA's Aeronautical Chart User's Guide, available at the FAA's website. For VFR charts, you either want the complete edition or the Visual Charting Products Only edition. Aeronautical charts have a grid system on them for locating or describing the location of any place on Earth. This is the geographic coordinate system, also known as lines of latitude and lines of longitude, or lat-longs. Lines of latitude, or parallels, run east and west on the charts and are used to measure the distance north or south of the equator in degrees. The equator is 0 degrees of latitude, and the number increases as you move away from the equator and toward the poles, with the poles being at 90 degrees of latitude. As you can see on this chart, the bottom line is 37 degrees of north latitude, meaning it is 37 degrees north of the equator. Lines of longitude, or meridians, run north and south on the chart and measure the distance east or west of the prime meridian, which runs through a village called Greenwich in London, England. This is called the prime meridian and is 0 degrees of longitude. Numbers again move up as you move away from the prime meridian until you get to the 180-degree point in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, near the international date line. As you can see on this chart, the leftmost line of longitude is 124 degrees of west longitude, or 124 degrees west of the prime meridian. Lat-long lines are subdivided into units called minutes. There are 60 degrees in a minute. A helpful shortcut for estimating distances on charts is that a minute of longitude equals 1 nautical mile. A minute of latitude is pretty close. 1 minute of latitude equals a nautical mile at the equator, but since the parallels get smaller as you move towards the poles, a minute of latitude is slightly less than a nautical mile in most of the U.S. On the chart, each of these little tick marks indicates 1 minute of latitude, and the tick mark at 5 is slightly larger, and then the one that goes across the line is 10 degrees. So you're looking at 37-degree line of north latitude here, so this would be 37 degrees 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And then the line that runs halfway between the two lines of latitude is 30 minutes. So this is 37 degrees, 30 minutes along this line right here of north latitude. And the same thing happens for our lines of longitude. So we have 123 degrees here. So we have 123 degrees 1 minute west, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And you also have a line running halfway in between. That's the 30-minute line. So this is 123 degrees, 30 minutes. And then each of these grid boxes is 30 minutes by 30 minutes. And to show a practical example of how you would measure a lat-long, we'll take our home airport that we've been flying out of Pine Bluff Regional. And you want to list off the latitude first and the longitude second. It is a lat-long, so latitude goes first. So this is the 34-degree line of north latitude, so we'll measure up from 34, it goes to 10. So it's just a little bit north of 34 degrees, 10 minutes of north latitude. And then we have the 91-degree line of west longitude, and here's the 92-degree line over here. So this is 92 degrees, or 91 degrees, 30 minutes. 40 minutes, 50 minutes, there's 55, so it's right at about 92 or 91 degrees, 56 minutes. And if we check with the AFD, it lists the latitude and longitude up in the top right-hand corner. It does it in degrees, minutes, and hundredths of minutes. You can actually divide minutes into seconds, but it doesn't do that. They use hundredths of minutes instead. And so we were pretty darn close, 34 degrees, 10 minutes, and 47 hundredths of a minute. And west 91 degrees, 56 minutes, and 14 hundredths of a minute. The colors on the base layer of the map indicate terrain elevation. Colors change in 1,000-foot increments from sea level to 3,000, then 2,000-foot increments to 9,000, then change colors a final time at 12,000 feet. Alaskan charts also include white for areas that have glaciers on them. Contour lines are used to connect areas of equal elevation and show how fast the terrain rises in a given area. For example, if I were to walk along this 10,000-foot contour line right here and stayed right on that line, I would never change elevation. I'd stay at 10,000 feet. The different lines indicate different elevations. So this is a 10,000-foot line, a 10,500-foot line, and an 11,000-foot line over here. And because the lines are spaced far apart, we know that the terrain rises fairly gradually, versus over here where they're all mashed together like this, we know that the terrain rises rapidly. In areas that the FAA considers to be non-mountainous, they'll sometimes put hatch marks on the contour lines to alert pilots that the terrain rises rapidly in that area. Each lat-long box contains a blue number called the maximum elevation figure. The FAA generally derives at this figure by taking the height of the tallest obstacle in this box, adding 100 feet, and then rounding up to the nearest 100 feet from there. In areas where terrain is the highest point, they generally add 300 feet and then round up to the nearest 100 feet. Flying at or above this altitude should assure you that you clear all obstacles in that grid, but not by much. So they're not altitudes you should fly at. A good rule of thumb is to use this number plus 1,000 feet to determine your minimum cruise altitude in a given area. The charts also depict a wide range of hydrological or water features, including oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, canals, swamps, and glaciers. The charts also depict man-made objects that can easily be identified from the air. The FAA refers to these as culture landmarks. The most prominent of these are cities. Larger cities and settlements are depicted as yellow-tinted areas. These represent the rough limits of the urban area and also depict what the shape of the city lights will look like from the air at night. If an area is too small to show as a yellow outline, it will be depicted as a small, open black circle. Roads are also depicted and are categorized as divided highways, primary roads, and secondary roads. Major routes, such as interstates and U.S. highways, are usually labeled. Other landmarks that are prominently depicted include railroads, power lines, bridges, dams, and outdoor features such as racetracks and amphitheaters. Post 9/11, symbols have also been added to depict college and pro stadiums, since temporary flight restrictions exist around them when they're occupied. These facilities are depicted with magenta diamonds. Fortunately, the stadiums are always empty in Flight Simulator. In rural areas where landmarks are sparse, things like tanks or ranches may be depicted. These are generally marked by small black squares or circles and labeled as to what they are. Obstructions, such as radio or TV towers, are depicted on the charts to let pilots know where they are and how high they are. Any tower taller than 200 feet should be on the chart, and obstructions between 200 and 1,000 feet in height are depicted as a small blue triangle with a dot at the bottom. Obstructions taller than 1,000 feet are depicted as a larger symbol. If the tower is depicted with electric symbols at the top, that indicates that the tower is equipped with high-intensity lighting, usually white strobe lights. Two altitudes are typically listed near the obstruction. The top bold blue number is the height of the obstruction above mean sea level. The bottom number in parentheses is its height above ground level. The old joke among pilots is that the top number is what your altimeter will read when you hit the obstacle, and the bottom number is how far your airplane will fall to the ground. If multiple obstructions are grouped together, often called an antenna farm by pilots, a group obstruction symbol may be used, and the height of the highest obstruction will be listed. Wind turbines are also displayed on the charts with the same information listed for their height. If there are a large number of turbines grouped together in a wind turbine farm, the area is surrounded by dashed blue lines, and the height of the highest turbine is listed nearby, surrounded by a blue rectangle. The chart also depicts some political boundaries as well, such as state borders, international borders, and time zone boundaries. Now let's talk a little bit about how airports are depicted in these charts. The basic airport symbol on a sectional is an open circle. If the circle is magenta, which is what the FAA calls this reddish color, that means the airport is uncontrolled, and if the symbol is blue, that means the airport has a control tower. An open circle indicates there are no hard-surfaced runways greater than 1,500 feet at that airport. If an airport has a hard-surfaced runway greater than 1,500 feet but less than 8,069 feet, the circle is filled in and the runway layout is depicted. All runways are depicted, even if one of them is not hard-surfaced or is less than 1,500 feet long. If the airport has services, which in Flight Simulator basically means a fuel pump or fuel truck, tick marks are put on the top, bottom, and sides of the circle. A star at the top of the circle indicates the airport has a rotating beacon. If a hard surface runway at the airport is greater than 8,069 feet, they get rid of the circle and just depict the runways. All runways are depicted, even if only one runway is longer than 8,069 feet. Again, blue has a control tower and magenta does not. These airports still have a star if they have a rotating beacon on the field, and most have fuel services available as well, though you'll need to check the AFD to be sure. Every airport has a data block near it that gives some quick reference information about the field. So let's take a look at the data block for Pine Bluff. At the top of the data block, we have the airport name, Pine Bluff Regional Grider Field. And next to that, in parentheses, we have the three-letter FAA identifier. If the identifier is 3 letters and the airport is located in the continental United States, you can add a K to the beginning of this, in other words, KPBF, and that gets you the 4-letter ICAO identifier, which is what you want to enter into a GPS or an FMS to navigate to this airport. If the airport does not have 3 letters, if it has numbers in there instead, it does not have a 4-letter ICAO identifier. And in a GPS, you would want to just enter the 3-letter identifier to be able to navigate to that airport. In airports that are outside the continental U.S., for an example, Alaska or Hawaii, it will list the name of the airport, then the 3-letter FAA identifier, and then the 4-letter ICAO identifier, as these can be quite different in these regions. Underneath that, it tells us weather information. It tells us that Pine Bluff has a ASOS, which is an automated surface observation system, and you can dial that in to listen to the weather. Automated weather report at 120775. There's 2 different types of stations that you'll see as automated weather stations: automated surface observation, ASOS, and automated weather observation stations at uncontrolled fields. And they're just slightly different in their capabilities. I don't think in Flight Simulator it really makes much of a difference. Underneath that line, it tells us the airport elevation, so it is at 206 feet MSL. The L tells us that the airport has lighted runways. The star means that they are pilot controlled, but that is not a function in Flight Simulator, so they're always on. The 6,000 feet tells us that the longest runway, and in Pine Bluff the only runway, is 6,000 feet long, and they do round up to the nearest 1,000 feet there. And then the bottom frequency is the Unicom. Unicom is a frequency where you call in and make requests for fuel. It's the radio that the FBO has, which is the fixed base operator, and they are the people that will sell you the fuel. And you can talk to them, and they will often give you airport advisors. They'll tell you if there are other aircraft in the pattern and which runway is in use in the real world. But in Flight Simulator, the Unicom does not work. The C tells us that this frequency also doubles as a common traffic advisory frequency, or CTAF. So that is a frequency that you make your position announcements on at an uncontrolled field, which is something you can do in Flight Simulator. Now let's take a look at a control tower field and see what the differences are. Okay, so here we are looking at a control tower at airport. This is Fort Smith Regional. The top lines give us the same information, airport name and identifier, and then under that we get CT, which is the control tower. So the frequency for the control tower is 118.3. The little star beside the control tower frequency means that it is part-time. It doesn't operate 24/7. But that is not true in Flight Simulator. All air traffic control facilities work 24/7 in Flight Simulator. Those are very hard-working AI controllers in Flight Simulator. The C next to it tells us that when the control tower is closed, that is the common traffic advisory frequency. But again, that's not a factor in Flight Simulator. Down below this, it tells us that the ATIS, which stands for Automated Terminal Information Service, is on frequency 126.3. ATIS is similar to AWOS or ASOS, and then it gives you weather information for the airport, but also gives you information about the runways that are in use and approaches that are in use if the field is IFR. And it's usually made manually by the controllers. And the older older control towers, they'll actually record it and put it out. Newer ones, it's actually digital. But obviously in Flight Simulator, it's always digital, and but you can tune it in and you'll get the weather and landing information for the airports. The data on the bottom is pretty much the same. The airport's at 469 feet. The runways are lighted part-time in the real world with pilot-controlled lighting, but that's not going to work in Flight Simulator. Longest runway is 8,000 feet long. Whenever you see a frequency all just hanging out by itself with no sort of designator, that is the Unicom frequency. So that would be on 122.95 in the real world, but again, Unicom frequencies do not work in Flight Simulator. Private airports are either depicted as a circle with an R in the middle if they are not hard surfaced, or have a remark of private above the airport data block if they are hard surfaced. These are typically things like fly-in residential areas or privately owned crop duster strips. In real life, these are on charts for emergency or landmark use. You need to get the owner's permission prior to landing there, or you could get yourself in trouble. But in Flight Sim, there won't be any penalties if you want to check them out. Just be aware that many of them are on the shorter side and data for them may not be available. If a military airport does not have a hard surface runway, it will be depicted as double circles rather than a single one, but there are not many of these in the US. If it has a hard surface runway, the symbol looks just like any other airport, and you have to use abbreviations in the airport name and the data block to identify them. Identifiers you see in military airport names include AFF for Army Airfield, AFB for Air Force Base, NAS for Naval Air Station, and NG or ANGB for National Guard or Air National Guard Base. Again, in Flight Sim, you're free to check those out if you want, but doing so in real life would get you a welcoming committee that's most likely armed. Heliports, abandoned airports, and ultralight parks are also charted in some places. In the real world, these are charted for landmark use. I doubt you could get a 152 down on an ultralight runway, and I definitely don't think you'll be able to get it stopped on a helipad. But there are some abandoned airports that still have decent pavement in Flight Simulator if you want to check those out. Just be careful. Sometimes they'll have trees and things on them, so maybe do a low pass before you try landing on those. Now let's take a look at radio navigation aids depicted on sectional charts. The primary radio navigation aid depicted on a sectional chart is the VOR, or VHF Omnidirectional Range. We'll get into specifics on how to use VORs in a separate lesson on VOR navigation, but we'll go ahead and talk about what's on the charts. There are three different types of VORs. A regular VOR is depicted as a hexagon symbol with a dot in the middle. A VOR with distance measuring equipment uses the same symbol but has a box around it. A VOR TACAN or VORTAC is a VOR co-located with a military navigation system called a TACAN. But for civilian users, it means it functions exactly like a VOR with DME, and it's depicted with a hexagon symbol that has bars on the sides and bottom of it. A compass rose surrounds the depiction of a VOR, and the arrow near the top of it points to magnetic north. More about that in a minute. Each VOR has a data block located in a blue box near the VOR station. If a VOR is located on an airport, there will be a dot at the approximate location of the VOR on the airport symbol. The compass rose will encircle the airport, and the type of VOR will be listed above the data block. Let's take a look at the data block for the Hot Springs VOR. So the blue box that has our data block is located below the VOR here. We can tell the VOR is on the field because it's got the dot and the airport symbol, and the compass rose surrounds the airport here. On the top of the box here, anytime you see a frequency on top of a VOR box, it's a flight service station, which is who you call to file flight plans and get weather reports and forecasts, but that does not work in Flight Simulator. But if we wanted to do that in real life, we dial in 122.1. The R means that they only receive on this frequency. The flight service station cannot transmit. So in order to hear them, we'd actually have to dial in the VOR to be able to hear them. So we'd listen on the VOR and we transmit on the radio frequency here. And then down at the bottom, it tells us that the flight service station we'd be talking to is Jonesboro Flight Service Station. And again, flight service stations do not work in Flight Simulator. Because the airport is because the VOR is located on the airport, it tells us that this is a VOR DME, since we don't have a VOR symbol to look at to tell us that. It tells us that the name of the VOR is Hot Springs VOR. The frequency that we'll want to tune in to be able to navigate off this VOR is 110.0. The channel is a military thing. That's for them to use with their TACAN equipment, and civilian users can't use that. Anytime you see a channel, though, you can tell that it has DME. Then it tells us that the identifier is HOT. All VORs have a 3-letter identifier. And then beside the 3-letter identifier, it gives us the Morse code that if we tune in and listen to the VOR, we'll be able to hear this Morse code until we're listening to the right station. The blue lines coming off the VORs are low-altitude airways, or Victor airways. A number with an arrow coming off the VOR indicates the VOR radial the airway is located on. Further from the VOR, the airway number is listed. If an airway goes straight between two VORs, the mileage between those two stations is located in a box below the airway number. Intersections on airways are depicted by 2 or more blue arrows, with the arrows pointing to the VORs that can be used to identify them. All intersections have 5-letter designations. So if we take a look here at Caney intersection down here, you can see we have an arrow pointing up here. This tells us that we can identify it with a 163-degree radial coming off of Pine Bluff, and an arrow pointing this way saying that we can identify it using the 230-degree radial coming off of Little Rock. For the intersection of those two VOR radials, we know we are at Caney intersection. So let's talk a little bit about magnetic north and true north. The magnetic north pole, the one your compass points to, is located at a slightly different place than the actual north pole. In other words, it's not quite at the top of the Earth. So depending on where you are on the Earth, the direction you would go to head to the actual North Pole, or true north, is slightly different than what your compass or heading indicator shows as north. Lines of longitude are always oriented to true north, and the arrow on a VOR's compass rose always points to magnetic north. So the reason they're tilted a little bit in some parts of the country is this difference between true north and magnetic north, called magnetic variation. There are dashed magenta lines on the sectional chart to show us the magnetic variation. These are called isogonic lines. The difference is very small in the center of the country and more pronounced as you move northwest, being most pronounced in Alaska. For Flight Simulator, though, we use magnetic headings for just about all of our flying, so it's not something we need to worry about too much. All headings and tracks in Flight Simulator are flown as magnetic ones. In the real world, wind direction is true unless reported by ATC. In Flight Simulator, it's not clear if you're setting the direction in true or magnetic, but even in areas of high magnetic variation, it's not going to make that much of a difference. The other type of nav aid depicted on the charts are NDBs, or non-directional beacons. You use your automatic direction finder, or ADF, to navigate using NDBs. Again, we'll cover that in another lesson. There are not many NDBs still in operation in the US, and even fewer are charted, as they've been pretty much replaced with GPS. They are depicted as a red circle with little dots around it, with a data box nearby with a frequency and identifier. So we've talked about everything we can see on the ground on the charts. Let's talk a little bit about what's above the ground, airspace. Of course, the thing about airspace in Flight Simulator is that you can completely ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist if you want to. I'll do a separate video with the details of airspace for those that want to include navigating airspace as part of their experience, but we'll hit the high points of what's on the charts in this lesson. Class B airspace is the airspace that surrounds busy airports and large metro areas. It's shaped like an upside-down wedding cake and is used to funnel large turbojet traffic down and into these hub airports. The ceiling is generally around 10,000 feet MSL, with the area near the airport extending to the surface, with several shelves as you move away from the big airport to allow aircraft to fly under the airspace. On the chart, it is depicted as solid blue lines, with blue numbers showing the base and ceiling of the airspace in each sector. There's also a magenta circle at 30 nautical miles from the central airport called the Mode C ring, which lets pilots know they need an altitude reporting transponder when flying inside this area. In real life, you need a clearance from air traffic control to enter Class B airspace. Class C airspace is located at larger airports with a significant number of large turbojet operations. Its design is similar to Class B airspace, just on a smaller scale, with the outer ring extending just 10 nautical miles from the airport. It usually has two rings, with the center one going from the surface to about 4,000 feet AGL, and the outer ring having a shelf pilots can fly under. It's depicted on the charts with solid magenta lines, with magenta numbers showing the top and bottom of the airspace. In the real world, you need to establish radio communications with ATC prior to entering this airspace. Class D exists at any airport that has a control tower, but is not a Class B or C airport. It usually consists of a single ring that extends from the surface to about 3,000 feet AGL and out from the airport to about 4 nautical miles. It is depicted with a dashed blue line with a blue number in a box showing the top altitude of the airspace. In the real world, radio communications with ATC is required to enter this airspace. A variation you'll see on Class D airspace is a TRSA, or a Terminal Radar Service Area. They are depicted as shaded black circles on the charts. In the real world, a TRSA offers the same radar services as a Class C area, but you don't have to participate. A TRSA will always have a Class D airport at the center, though, so in the real world, you need to contact the tower before entering that area. The depictions of a TRSA on the chart also has the floor and ceiling of where you can receive radar service in a TRSA area in the real world. You'll also see checkpoint flags around a TRSA. These are VFR checkpoints. In the real world, when you check in with approach near or in a TRSA, you can tell them what checkpoint you're over so they can quickly identify your position. The rest of the chart area is filled in by Class G and Class E airspace. Class G is uncontrolled airspace and hugs the ground, while Class E is above it. Class E typically starts at 1,200 feet AGL and extends up to 18,000 feet, but there are areas where it starts lower that are depicted on the charts. In some areas, Class E will be lowered to 700 feet AGL. This is depicted on the chart as a soft magenta shading. On areas in the inside of the soft shading, the Class E airspace extends down to 700 feet AGL, and on areas on the hard side of the shading, Class E begins at 1,200 feet AGL. In other areas, Class E airspace extends to the ground. This is depicted on the charts as a dashed magenta line. In the real world, you do not have to talk to anyone or get a clearance to operate VFR, or under visual flight rules, in Class E or G airspace. But you do have to get a clearance to operate under instrument flight rules, or IFR, in Class E airspace. In real life, whether you can get ATC services depends on how high you are and where you are. You can always get radar services in Class B and C airspace and in TRSAs. Outside of these areas, radar coverage is dependent on terrain, and in some areas of the country you need to be pretty high, at least 5,000 feet above the ground, to be in radar contact. In Flight Simulator, though, it doesn't really seem to matter what type of airspace you're in. You can pretty much get ATC services anywhere or anytime, regardless of your position or altitude. The other types of airspace depicted on the charts are called special use airspace. These areas are depicted with red hatched lines for military operations areas and alert areas, and blue hatched lines for restricted, prohibited, and warning areas. These areas exist because some type of hazard exists in these areas that makes flying there dangerous, things like artillery fire. But with the exception of prohibited areas, the hazard does not exist all the time. The airspace is also three-dimensional, so you may be able to fly over or under it. Information on the times of use and altitudes for these areas can be found on the side panel of the chart they're on. But of course, in Flight Simulator, you can also just pretend they don't exist. So let's take a look at the special use airspace information on the Memphis sectional here. It lists the restricted, prohibited, and warning areas at the top, the blue airspace, and then it lists alert and then military operations areas down below that. It gives you the number of the area or the name of the area, and then it gives the altitudes that the area exists at. So for like restricted area 2401A and B, that goes from the surface to 30,000 feet MSL. And time of use, SR to SS, is sunrise to sunset. And then in the real world, you'd contact Memphis Center to find out if it's active or not. It generally, on the restricted area, the blue areas, it gives you the altitudes in pretty plain language. So like for 2402B, it goes from 10,000 up to, but not including flight level 220 or 22,000 feet. Some of the areas may be active by notices to airmen, so you would have to contact either Memphis Center or a flight service station to know if those areas are active. They do the language a little bit differently on the military operations areas. The altitudes that they list are the floor of the MOA. So the AN high, it starts at 7,000 feet, and if it doesn't list an altitude for the top, that means it goes up to 18,000 feet. They do the same thing with the times of use, and you can see if it doesn't list the floor, it will put in pretty plain language. The AN low goes from 100 feet AGL and then up to 7,000 feet. There are also areas along the coast and Mexican border called Air Defense Identification Zones, or ADIZ. They're depicted by a bunch of magenta dots. Again, in Flight Simulator, you don't have to pay attention to them, but in real life, you need to either file an IFR flight plan or what's called a Defense VFR or DVFR flight plan when you're flying back into the United States through one of these areas if you don't want to be intercepted by a fighter jet. There's also a special flight rules area that surrounds the Washington, D.C. area that has a myriad of rules you need to follow if you want to go into it in real life, and some pretty harsh consequences if the rules are not followed. Mercifully, this airspace is not replicated in Flight Simulator, and the area is treated like a normal Class B area. You'll also find areas with magenta dashed lines on occasion on the charts. These are a little thicker than what you'd find at the Class E surface areas. These areas are national security areas, and in real life, pilots are requested to avoid overflights below certain altitudes in these areas. And I have a hunch that if you didn't oblige their request, you'd probably get to have an uncomfortable conversation with a government official. You'll also see gray lines running over the chart in various places with VR and IR number designations. These are military training routes and are depicted so real-life pilots know that there may be high-speed military aircraft operating on them that they need to watch out for. Not really something as a flight simulator pilot you need to worry about. And while technically not airspace, areas with solid blue lines that have blue dots on the inside of them are conservation or wildlife protection areas. And in real life, pilots are requested to avoid overflights of these areas below 2,000 feet AGL to avoid disturbing the wildlife that's being protected in these areas. There are also areas depicted on the charts for things like high volume training activities or parachute activities or glider activities and even space flight now. But these areas really aren't a factor in Flight Simulator either. As mentioned earlier, terminal area charts have a larger scale and show more detail than do sectional charts, but the symbology is largely the same. The only exception is that all airports with paved runways are shown as runway depictions rather than circles. And then the back of the chart also shows the routes that jets use coming into and out of that terminal area. And it also shows the best routes and altitudes for VFR traffic to use to circumnavigate the Bravo airspace. So that covers most of what you'll find on VFR charts. So let's talk a little bit about how you actually use the Skyvector site to look at charts. So when you first load into Skyvector, it's just skyvector.com. You don't need a www. It will probably load you into a chart like this that's just kind of a overview of the United States. And if you've used it before, it will just take you to the last area that you've used. And then from there, you can just zoom in. You can use the plus or minus buttons down here to zoom in, or you can just use your mouse wheel. So we'll scroll down into Pine Bluff area for our home base. And you've got a little over in the left-hand corner a flight planner here, which is kind of handy for using in Flight Simulator, but we'll cover the basics of that when we do our actual cross-country lesson. Over here on the right, you've got a Zulu clock, so it shows you what the time is in UTC or Zulu right now. And then you see if in the middle of the chart here, you have a little cross, and then this lat-long coordinate right there is where that cross is situated. So if you want to know the lat-longs of a certain coordinate, you can just put the cross over there, and it will give you the lat-long coordinates for that. The layers has things like weather. It will display weather reports, temporary flight restrictions, SIGMETs, things like that. So if you're wanting to deal with real world weather and want to know what things are doing out there, that's a good tab to use. Navigation, this is just kind of golly gee whiz stuff for sim pilots, but it will show you the locations of like the North Atlantic tracks and the Pacific tracks if you're wanting to see how folks are getting across the oceans right now. It also has a thing that's handy for real world pilots for showing fuel prices at FBOs on the chart there. So that's kind of cool. The main section that we'll be using is the chart selection tools up here. You can see right now I'm currently in World VFR. And that's just a conglomeration of all the different sectional charts that are available. You'll see if I scroll over here to the west, it transitions me automatically to the Dallas-Fort Worth chart, and we don't have to run into chart edges or things like that. All the different charts that are selectable, we have our IFR charts over here. So World High is a conglomeration chart of all the high IFR charts. World Low is a conglomeration of the world IFR low charts, and then you can select individual the high chart here or the individual low IFR chart here. And then if I want to actually see the sectional chart for the area I'm in, I click on, right now I'm currently in Memphis, so I click on that, and that shows me the actual sectional chart complete with the borders, which has things like the lat-longs, a little more easy to read on the edge there. It has the legend there, the effective dates, the chart coverage map. It has information on all the control towers that are in this area, all the Class B and C areas that are in the area. And then down at the bottom left is our special use airspace panel. And then over at the center here, we have all the terrain information for this particular chart and terrain conversion information. And then to get back to the World VFR, I just click on World VFR. And then if I scroll over to the Memphis area, let's see here, we'll go, that's Dallas over there. So here's Memphis. It gives me, as I get to a terminal area, it shows me more charts because there's more charts available. So I can go in and actually take a look at the terminal area chart in Memphis now. And again, it's got the whole chart since it's not scrollable on the edges. And I can zoom in and out. And there are some sectional chart programs where if you zoom in a certain amount, it will automatically take you to a terminal area chart if one is available. But you actually have to switch to the chart here in this on Skyvector. We'll go back to World VFR and let's look at a slightly larger terminal area. We'll go down to Dallas. And you can see for Dallas, it brings up quite a few more charts. We have the IFR charts, World VFR. We also have a IFR area chart. We also have the regular terminal area chart. If you access the fly chart, that is the VFR flyways that shows you the airliner routes coming in and the flyways that you can use to go VFR around Class Bravo areas. And then you also have a helicopter chart if you're interested in looking at that sort of stuff, and helicopter inset there. So a lot of fun charts to look at Dallas-Fort Worth. All right, so that covers how to use Skyvector. That covers how to use VFR Aeronautical charts. I know it's been a longer lesson, and I appreciate you bearing with me. And next lesson will be a flight lesson covering actual VFR cross-country flying. Really, I promise. I'm going to do it this time. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.